Welcome to Rethinking Communication. I'm your host, Michael Ashford. Come with me on a journey as I explore how we better connect with each other through the power of our words. For most of us, formal education left gaps in our ability to communicate well with each other, especially when trying to navigate conflict, inspire change, and overcome misunderstandings. I'm a former journalist, a speaking coach, and a communication expert, and my goal is to encourage you to rethink what it means to be an effective communicator, whether that's on a stage, in a meeting room, in the living room, and everywhere in between. Robin Reames is an associate professor of English at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and the author of the book, The Ancient Art of Thinking for Yourself, The Power of Rhetoric in Polarized Times. Now, what is rhetoric? Even me asking that question 100 years ago would have been absurd. It would have been out of this world, crazy for me to even ask the question, what is rhetoric? As Robin writes in her book, it's a meta-language that describes and explains how language works, and for years, thousands of years, it was understood. It was a deeper look into not just do we agree or disagree with what's being said, but why words are chosen, how they impact the conversation that we're having, the meaning behind and the ideology behind words, not just the words themselves. That's the art of rhetoric. That's the practice of rhetoric. And we have lost that, says Robin in this conversation and in her book. And so we explore what we've lost, how it can impact us, and how we can apply it to a lot of the conversational and communicative issues that we're dealing with today. Because as Robin writes in The Ancient Art of Thinking for Yourself, in forgetting about rhetoric, however, we unfortunately also forgot about the things it once taught us, how and why certain words and modes of communication have the power to persuade us and therefore to dictate our thoughts and determine our actions. You wrote in your book to ancient rhetoricians, and I don't know if I'm saying that correctly, disputes like ours would be a fruitless waste of time and energy, and that today we're a PG-13 version of rhetoric's former uncensored glory. That's a lot to just say. My question is, what do you mean by that? What are the fruitless wastes of time that the ancient rhetorics would have just thought, gosh, this is not at all what it was intended to be?
Yeah. Well, those were two separate ideas, but you're absolutely right that they are interrelated to each other. The reason that ancient rhetoricians would say that a lot of our political debates are fruitless wastes of time stems from the fact that we spend so little time trying to understand why we disagree. We understand that we disagree. We state our disagreements over and over again ad nauseum. We take up positions on issues. We do it in a kind of snap judgment sort of way. We often make our political stake our political flag plant our flag in the ground on the basis of whether we find ourselves on the right or the left of the spectrum. We recycle opinions that we hear on social media or on the news, pass them off as our own. We serve as broadcast or relay stations for other people's opinions that are sort of designed to be repeatable. These are all things that the ancient rhetoricians would have thought as a fruitless waste of time, precisely because we're not spending any time trying to understand the roots of our disagreement, where our disagreements come from, where they arise in the first place. Um, Ancient rhetoricians really saw problems in the polis. They saw political problems as sicknesses, illnesses. We don't really think of them that way. We think of them as like an opportunity to vilify an opponent, to reassert our own view and our own opinion. We think of ourselves as being on the right side of justice. We think of the people who disagree with us as being on the wrong side. Right? This is true whether you're on the right or the left. We have a tendency to think in these terms, in these sort of polarized terms, about our fellow citizens or about our fellow members of our own, the same society, facing the same problems, affecting us all in different ways. Ancient rhetoricians would have seen that sickness as something that could kill us as a state. It would make us non-viable as a state. It would lead to us not being able to function as a state. We wouldn't be able to solve those problems. And that would make us vulnerable. That would make them vulnerable in their minds, not only to a kind of civic and ethical and social decay, but also would make them vulnerable, as history proved again and again, to outside enemies, to actual enemies, as opposed to ideological enemies. And the reason that I say that, what we have of rhetoric, what survived of rhetoric, is a kind of uncensored or a censored version, a PG-13 version of its former uncensored glory, stems from the fact that we just don't really study language in the same way that rhetoric was designed to help people to study. So those are kind of two sides of the same problem in a way. The ancient rhetoricians believed that by studying language and persuasion, understanding how ideas take shape, understanding how people become persuaded of positions and ideas, you can listen better, you can understand better, but you can also come to an understanding of where the disagreements arise in the first place. And therefore, you can figure out what a solution is. You can figure out not how to agree on everything, but how to agree on some practical solutions to some of those social and political problems. And so they studied all the forms of argumentation, all the forms of persuasion, everything that they saw that worked, that had an effect on how people thought, how they acted, how they behaved, how they responded to issues. They studied that. They memorized other speeches. They practiced their own. They sparred with one another. And when we think about rhetoric today, we might have a kind of passing familiarity with some of its history. We might have heard, of like the logos, ethos, pathos, 3-part logic, emotion, and authority, but not the whole, not the whole tradition, and not all those various and copious and powerful methods of persuasion and forms of language. So those are those two sides of that equation. One is rhetoric helps us understand how persuasion works, and therefore leads to our better understanding about how disagreements arise, and also how to reach a kind of resolution to them. But also the fact that we don't spend much time thinking about this only adds fuel to the fire, that increases and accelerates the problems that beset us, where we need to work together to understand each other better, find better solutions.
Now, before we go any further, how is rhetoric defined? Let's give ourselves a baseline here before I've got so many questions based off what you've just said, but let's level set here. What is rhetoric?
So as I mentioned in the book, and you would already know this is like the number one question I get asked.
Yeah.
When I tell people that I study rhetoric is, what's that? Never heard of that before. Or is like, people study that, right? Isn't that just bullshit? How do you study that, right? And the thing that's so funny to me, and I write this in the book, the thing that's so just uncanny to me about that question is it would have been absolutely unaskable at any point in history in the Western tradition up until roughly 100 years ago. There's like nobody who wouldn't have known what rhetoric was, because it was, for centuries, the foundation of education. It was the foundation of all further study. The basic idea was that you had to understand how language worked if you were to understand how any form of knowledge takes shape. And so that's why rhetoric was taught alongside logic and grammar, right? You have to understand the mechanics, you have to understand the persuasion, you have to understand the logical inner workings of language. And so really rhetoric is the study of language. It's what has grown and accreted over several centuries as a vast vocabulary. What I describe in the book as a meta language, a language that refers to other language, a language about language, that just catalogs and explains and explores and describes how language works its power on us. We have a tendency to think about language as somehow providing this clear glass on the world, this clear glass on reality. And so consequently, we're not really aware of how, whether we know it or not, it's persuading us all the time. The way ideas get packaged, the way reality gets described to us, the way reality gets packaged to us is always working a kind of persuasive power on us. Rhetoric has always been interested in and dedicated to describing how language does that. That in a kind of nutshell is rhetoric. To get more granular and to get more specific, it's a matter of like learning that vast vocabulary and understanding how to notice when it's at play, to be able to identify first in a kind of a clunky and awkward and non-intuitive way, how metaphors are functioning, how stories are functioning, how ideology is sort of being packaged implicitly in the language we use. But over years, over time, over a kind of repetition, it becomes second nature. It becomes sort of part of your repertoire. It becomes something you notice just when you read the daily news in the morning.
That is so very true. Ever since starting this show, it has been an exercise in just noticing how people bring their ideas to bear for others. Going back to your first kind of dive into the book and into that question I asked about it's being a fruitless waste of time. You said the ancient rhetoricians thought of it like a sickness that would eventually destroy us. How does it come to be that we look at someone else who disagrees with us as they're the ones who are sick, not me? They're the ones who are going to destroy us. It's their illness, it's their sickness. And then we come up with all of these, as you mentioned in the book, the metaphors of war or taking the warlike posture when there's not actually war to be fought. The language we attach to people who like they're animals, they're vermin. I mean, we've seen that in all through history, attaching these kinds of names to people. How does it come to be, Robin, that we disregard our role in the sickness?
Yeah, I think that's maybe a question for a philosopher more than a rhetorician, right? Or it's a human question. It's a question of, I think, human nature more than it is about the language. I mean, it's something that we humans do. We humans have a tendency to think in very tribal ways, like we trust our insiders and we distrust the outsiders, right? That's actually what's different about democracy. I mean, in some sense, that verges on a sort of rhetorical and historical question. It's supposedly different in democracy. It's different about what was different about the rise of democracy from every form of social and political organization that preceded it was that it was not based on a sort of insider outsider, not in the same sense anyway, not in a kind of familial way, right? Where my family and my cohort, my homies are my people that I know and I trust, right? And that we're the inside and we're the right, we're the good. Yeah. And everybody who's different from me, other than me, is to be distrusted. That's a kind of instinctual response that humans have. And so I'm speaking just as, a person, not as a rhetorician when I'm saying that. In rhetoric, though, like what's interesting is how that impulse gets marshaled in language or how that impulse gets exploited in language. So you can actually trace that sort of natural response that people have to what goes on in the language. So like that's one of the reasons it's very effective, for example, to motivate people by the use of fear or to motivate people by the use of anger. Aristotle was the first in the Western tradition to note that there's like a direct link between using certain words and conjuring certain emotions. And that not only that, but negative emotions are super effective in persuading people. And Aristotle observed that people, when they're experiencing negative emotions, are prone to deliberate and prone to act. And what he meant by that was literally like they're prone to think about the future. That's deliberation was always future oriented for the ancient rhetoricians. So they're prone to deliberate about what they should do in response to their feeling of fear and anger. I mean, it's kind of fascinating to me. It's not kind of fascinating. It's very fascinating to me that Aristotle had his finger on this, more than 2.5 millennia ago. He was completely aware of this. And this is something that psychologists and brain scientists notice our attachment to negative emotions. We have a kind of addiction to negative emotions. He observed also that we feel a kind of pleasure in feeling them. We imagine doing harm to somebody who's causing us fear, right? We imagine somebody, when we feel angry, we imagine somebody getting revenge on them. So, that human question that you asked me, which, is outside of my field of expertise, that human question you asked me, really, you can see how it can be exploited in the language precisely by playing on those emotions. One of the real benefits of studying rhetoric is you kind of notice when somebody's trying to do that to you before you feel the feeling. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a difference between feeling the feeling first and
Yeah.
noticing the attempt to evoke the feeling. It's not necessarily something people are eager to give up. Like I said, like Aristotle observed, we enjoy negative emotions. Brain science says, yeah, we respond to negative emotions in the same way that we respond to cocaine and gambling. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we have to like have a moment where we realize like maybe it's not good for us. Maybe it's not good for our relationships to be sort of dwelling and steeping and bathing in negative emotions. And one of the beautiful side effects of studying rhetoric is that because it inserts that moment where what you're noticing is how people are provoking emotions more than you are feeling the emotions, it actually ends up making people happier. Believe it or not, it doesn't
No
seem like
doubt.
that would be an effect of studying rhetoric, but in fact it is.
That is fascinating. Absolutely. I've never thought of it that way. And to go back to something you said, that it hasn't been taught like 100 years ago, I wouldn't have even have asked you that question, Robin, about what is rhetoric and needing to have it explained. The question that I had in reading the book is that's thousands and thousands of years ago that Aristotle and was talking about these things and many other rhetoricians. Why have we not advanced past this to where we even need to have the conversation?
The advance beyond past the like the forgetting of rhetoric, do you mean by that?
Advanced beyond language having that ability to persuade, as you just discussed, the ability to subvert emotions and capitalize on them in the ways that you just talked
Hmm.
about. Why have we not advanced past that being so effective?
So I take it from your question, Michael, it just sounds to me, and I don't know you, we're just meeting for the first time, but as a rhetorician, I'm always kind of listening to the language that people use and
Of
thinking
course.
about what kinds of things they've been persuaded of. And I'm sensing in you that you've been kind of persuaded by some powerful rhetoric that would suggest that, in the words of the Beatles, you've got to admit it's getting better. That things somehow we're on a kind of upward trajectory. That there is a kind of progress to, say, the human ascent. You're a humanist. Am I reading this correctly? Am I getting this correctly?
Yeah, there's a belief within me that um, with all of the world's knowledge at our fingertips, with
Mhm.
with just the advancement of technology, with the crossing of borders now as easy as it is, with the diversity that we are exposed to, it just seems like, yeah, there would be an advancement of our understanding of how communication can both play and prey on our
Mhm.
emotions, on and with
Yeah.
our emotions. I think you're hitting on something correct there.
So I think I see things a little bit differently. I see history a little bit differently. I see it not as a straight line. I see it more as a cycle. I think any kind of long view of history would suggest that there's a cyclical nature to our remembering and forgetting, and our remembering and forgetting. And the more we remember things, and the more we dedicate ourselves to a study of a certain subject, the more equipped we are to use the skills that are marshaled by those disciplines, the skills that those disciplines were designed to hone. And therefore, the more inoculated we are against the harms that not having those disciplines uh, can wreak. And I think anytime we forget a body of knowledge, we're opening ourselves to the harms that that body of knowledge was designed to cure. And in the case of rhetoric, I think forgetting rhetoric, forgetting about rhetoric, and I mean, there are plenty of people who study rhetoric, but it's not in the popular culture. It's not a,
Mhm.
it's, I mean, the same, every high school student knows what literature is. Every high school student knows what mathematics is, but not very many people know what rhetoric is because it's just not as widely studied. And so I think if the answer to the question about rhetoric is sort of maybe one species of a larger genus, is in the overall experience that anytime we've forgotten a specific disciplinary skill, anytime we've lost knowledge, or we're in the process of losing knowledge, or we just stop paying attention to knowledge that was so carefully curated over the course of centuries, carefully curated and preserved and passed down, well, we're opening ourselves up to the vulnerabilities that come from not having that knowledge. I mean, the encouraging thing, though, is that it's still there, and there's still people studying it, And there are books on it, and those books are readable to greater or lesser extents. I mean, one of the reasons I wrote the book that I wrote was that a lot of this knowledge is actually just like very inaccessible. A lot of it is tucked away inside of many books that haven't even been translated. Some books that really haven't been read in centuries. Some of them are, even if they're read, they're kind of unreadable. And so one of my goals was to pick and choose from that whole long 2,500 year history and to distill what I consider to be the most useful, most applicable, most relevant skills to our lives today, but to make them accessible, to make them ingestible, understandable, and to reveal their relevance, to put it sort of blatantly on display.
To make it relevant, Robin, you wrote a lot about your relationship with your father. And I think I don't know anybody who has not had a similar experience with someone in their life as you wrote about, the just not only the disagreement, but the fracturing of the relationship because of, in particular, you write about politics in that fracturing of your relationship with your father. Um, the question for you, Robin, is how does that affect your work? How has that fracturing of your relationship affected your work in this study of rhetoric?
Yeah, I think it's affected my work in a really wonderful way. I think the first way that it's affected me is just as a teacher. One of the real benefits of coming from a world that's like very different from the world, not only that my students come from, but the world of academia, the world that I sort of live in and move and have my being in today, is that it gives me the ability to understand where people are coming from when they're coming from like radically different orientations from me or from each other in the classroom. um, it's such a benefit. They're really I don't think I've ever had a student whose orientation or ideas have been frightening to me. And I think sometimes it can, or at least it seems to me that it can have that experience or can have that effect when people encounter ideas that they consider to be, from their perspective, either wrong or incorrect, but in some ways like dangerous or threatening. It doesn't feel that way to me. It feels like
Mhm.
it's possible to have a conversation and understand where people are coming from. Um, but really, it's also affected my work just in terms of writing this book. I think in writing this book, I really wanted to write this book for people that disagree with each other. I wanted people that have radically different orientations and radically different positions and perspectives on issues and politics and ideas to be able to gain some value from the book by at least beginning to understand how, on the one hand, a lot of the disagreements we're having arise from things that we're not even talking about. And so we have an opportunity to begin talking about the deeper issues that motivate our disagreements rather than the surface issues that we think we're having disagreements about. But also to begin to understand that we have partial understanding. We don't have complete and full understanding. I mean, I think for me, growing up in the Deep South and growing up in a very dogmatic and religious household, but that one that was also extremely conservative, um, politically, what I hear people say about the right or MAGA or Trump or whatever just never really captures the people that I know and the people
Mhm.
that I grew up with. I think I understand their perspective. That's not to say that I agree with it or that I think that it's correct, but I don't see mutual understanding on both sides of the political spectrum these days. And so being growing up in a frustrating situation with my dad where we would never understand each other, I think eventually led to me getting to the point where I felt like I understood his perspective. I didn't feel like he understood mine, but I understood his perspective. But then I also saw this sort of like lack of understanding reflected in the popular culture as a whole and the
Yeah.
political culture of the United States as it was taking shape. And I it seemed to me that I was like, I kind of understand where this person's coming from, and I understand where that person's coming from, but I can also see that they don't understand where each other's coming from. So really, it's affected my work in that way. It hasn't affected the way I read or understand the rhetorical tradition, but the rhetorical tradition has definitely helped me understand that lack of understanding, if that makes sense.
It does. It does. And you hit on that we're arguing over issues that we don't even understand or realize are the issues that we're arguing. We've got the surface level things. You wrote, we often believe we're making arguments about a specific policy when in fact we're making arguments about our deeper ideologies. Can you give me an example of that? What does that mean? And this is the part of the book, Robin, that I found fascinating when you got into some of these examples. What does it mean to be arguing about one thing that might be up here on the surface, but really the exploration it takes to get to the deeper ideology?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, what the example you're drawing out from the book is a really useful example for showing how rhetoric works, because our ideology is getting packaged in our language all of the time, and often when we think we're discussing one issue, and the part of the book you're referring to is actually, it takes on a kind of pitted and somewhat controversial and very acrimonious debate about like Black Lives Matter and the protests and debates that erupted after George Floyd's killing. We're going back and forth over the issue of racism, and that's not to say that the issue that under in question and the social problem in question is not a problem of racism,
Right.
but it's to say, in going back and forth in discussions about racism and sloganeering Black Lives Matter versus Blue Lives Matter or All Lives Matter or whatever the response is,
Mm-hmm.
we're not necessarily aware of how those arguments are packaging these deeper ideological assumptions. So in the book, one thing I show is how if you pay close attention to not just the language, but also to how people construct their arguments on these issues, you can see that there's a much deeper disagreement, not about whether racism is a problem or whether systemic racism exists, or whether systemic racism is the cause of killings like the killing of George Floyd. But there's a deeper disagreement about whether individual autonomous action can account for phenomena in the world, as opposed to whether structural forces undergird and inform what phenomena and things that happen in the world.
Yep.
So it's not necessarily apparent to people who are making these arguments, but if you pay attention to the way that the arguments are constructed, there's always this silent assumption, there's this silent warrant that's justifying the way that people are using evidence to support their position, using evidence to support their claim, that suggests that if they believe, like the example I give of Candace Owens' argument about George Floyd, if they believe that it's not really a problem, it's because they really believe that the individual is ultimately and entirely autonomous. That is to say that Derek Chauvin is a completely free agent, independent actor, acting entirely on his own, versus the idea of there being systemic problems that we do not have the ability to entirely overcome through just independent decision making and autonomous action. And yet, if you pay attention to the way these arguments take shape, we don't discuss that difference of opinion. We don't discuss the difference between really believing in autonomy and individuality versus really believing in the power of a systemic structure. And it's not only that, it's even more complicated than that, that even where people are making arguments about things like systemic racism, they're not always aware that the way that they're making those arguments actually work against the idea of systemic racism. Like, that is, that they believe that when they make an argument that systemic racism exists, they begin verging on arguments in favor of individual autonomy, where they're kind of defining the systemic part of systemic racism as individual autonomous actors individually autonomously being and thinking racist and acting in racist ways. And so it actually also kind of explains why there's this sort of disagreement, right? Because then somebody like Candace Owens hears that argument and she says, well, that is an argument that, every individual cop is autonomously, individually, and deliberately racist, right? As opposed to understanding it for what it is, which is an argument that suggests, look, the structure is bigger than you and me, right? It's baked into the society, and the only way to address it is through larger social structural changes. But if we're not having a discussion about where the structural issues should temper our belief in individual autonomy, or where a desire to reassert individual power and our autonomy should begin to affect the structure, well, then we're not really getting anywhere. We're just going back and forth. Again, it's back to that like fruitless waste of time, right? Because all we're doing is asserting positions on these issues as though the end of it were to disagree, right? As though the purpose of it were just to disagree,
Yeah.
as opposed to figuring out how to use a kind of optimistic belief in individual autonomy to try to change a structure, or how to understand a structural problem as a structural problem, not as an idea that every single individual agent is down to their core a racist, right?
Yeah.
That's not an argument that's really going to convince that many people.
No, certainly not. And we see it in, you can take that in so many other arguments that we're having, Robin, right? Like the gun control or the gun issues. The same argument comes up, does it not? Of we hear it all the time. It's a individual lone wolf actor. It's a mentally unstable person versus it is a system-wide problem of access to firearms. And it's the same argument at the undergirding of individual autonomy versus how systems are controlled. Am I hitting on the same idea here?
I think you are there. That there's just it's part of our identity as a nation. It's part of our shared identity, and a lot of it has to do with when our nation came into being, and the rhetoric that was so powerful in shaping a national ethos was really rooted in modern philosophy and modern philosophy's belief in autonomous agency, in the idea of the individual human and the individual human's freedoms and the individual human's ability to shape things and determine their own destiny. Right? It really is. It's that those sentiments run so deep in our culture, and so it makes sense that they would have this enormous staying power in the arguments that we use and the rhetoric that we use to respond to social and political issues, but also it helps to make sense for why that would be so persuasive and why it's really hard to even challenge it with an idea of how systemic issues perpetuate injustice, how structural issues perpetuate social problems, where we have to be able to think more capaciously and in a more modern and contemporary understanding of how social issues arise and are maintained. But yeah, absolutely. So many, I mean, anybody who's paying attention to the way that American political rhetoric takes shape and circulates would know that we have a strong predilection and a strong favoritism for the idea of the individual, whether it's individual rights, individual autonomy, individuality, individualism, right? These are all parts of our sort of our culture. They're part of our cultural values that we share. And that I'm not suggesting that we dismiss with those cultural values entirely.
Yeah.
I'm suggesting that we pay attention to how those are used in really persuasive ways to persuade us of things. And there are other explanations that could also temper those really deeply held values.
Robin, adding to the complexity of this for me was when you talked about facts in the book, or you wrote about facts. And one that I highlighted, wrote down, that just kind of I thought about this for a while was facts only need to be denied once to lose their status as fact in rhetoric. And the very idea that something is a fact means that it can be also disproven. The likelihood may not be high. How does that add to the complexity of these deeper ideological issues when even just the denial of something as a fact, whether you're contradicting yourself or not, ultimately throws everything into a state of, well, I don't know how to think now. I mean, we have alternative facts now, right? um,
Yeah.
what does that do to the complexity of this issue?
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, it points out the enormous complexity of the situation that we're in, but in another way, it kind of distills and clarifies it to some extent, or at least for me, it does. That idea that facts really only need to be denied once in order to lose their status as a fact. It's an idea that came from two rhetorical theorists from the 20th century named Chaim Perlman and Lucy Ulbricht's Titeka. And they wrote this enormous book. I'm not going to say it's unreadable, but it's not an easy one to read. And so it's one of the ones that I sort of picked and chose to distill some of the things that I find to be most useful. This is one of them. But they were not writing out of ignorance. They were writing out of an exceptional state of awareness of how much damage, how much social and political damage this can do, because they had both lived through the Second World War. Chaim Perlman was a survivor of the Holocaust. He fought in the Jewish resistance in Brussels, in Belgium. And so really this tome that they wrote together was written in the aftermath of that, to try to account for where things went wrong and how things went wrong. They called it the new rhetoric. The idea essentially was that, in the same way that we were talking about earlier in this conversation, there seemed to be a real problem with the atrophy of rhetorical arts that had led to so many of the problems of thought, that led to problems of action and just utter atrocities in the 20th century in Europe. And so one of the things they noted was just that how easy facts are to knock down. And so they sort of diagnosed that when it happens in really just two ways. One is that people will say, "Oh, that's not a fact. How do you know?" Well, it contrasts these other facts that I found. I've gathered together these other facts, and look, they're not coherent to one another, or they're not compatible to one another. I loved that Kellyanne Conway alternative facts line. I mean, this is the kind of thing that rhetoricians really enjoy, when somebody just says it like you just told me that that's what you were doing, right? Yep. And you're absolutely right. That's exactly what you're doing. You're denying a fact, and you're trying to rhetorically weaken it. And the way you're doing it, you put it right on the surface, is by saying there are these alternative facts that would knock it down. I mean, this was what Perlman and Ulbricht's Titeka noted in the mid 20th century. And the other way is they say it's not a fact, it's an argument. It's something people are arguing for, right? People are arguing that the Sandy Hook school shooting didn't happen, and they're making that argument, that it did happen. They're making that argument because they want to impose stricter gun laws. It's just one point on the long argumentative path to stricter gun laws, right? Mm-hmm. So the reason I say it kind of simplifies things in a messy and convoluted world of fact denial, of conspiracy theories, of misinformation and disinformation, is it gives us something to look for. When somebody says, "That's not a fact, here are these other facts," or "That's not a fact, that's an argument," it tips us off that it's possible that what's going on is not a revealing of truth, but an act of fact denial. And that doesn't mean it works every time, but it does give us a method and a way we can diagnose some of those misinformation and disinformation moves, a way we can sort of be on the lookout for the repeated techniques that people use in this way. It's different, actually. It's the opposite. I mean, I think one of the most brilliant observation of that very large, which I'm not going to call unreadable, because I would like for people to read a book, The New Rhetoric by Perlman and Ulbricht Titeka. One of their most brilliant observations is that in rhetoric, the situation with facts and values is reversed. We think of values as these sort of intangible, subjective things that are movable. They're more like feelings. They're not fixed. They're not certain, right? But in rhetoric, as we were just talking about, with the kind of deep value that we place as Americans on things like individuality, individual autonomy, individual rights, those things don't go away. They're very hard to unseat. And when they've been introduced in rhetoric, I mean, good luck convincing somebody that just individualism doesn't matter, right? Or individual rights don't matter. No one's going to be convinced of that, right? And so these values, they have these deep roots. They have these deep cultural roots. They actually bind us together. We agree a lot on values. Whether or not we agree on where those values should be applied or where they're relevant, that's a different question. But yeah, the brilliant observation they made was that facts, then, which we think of as fixed, firm, immutable, like not open to being challenged in the rhetoric, again, it's the opposite. All they have to do is just be denied, and then all of a sudden, everything's in play, right? Nothing's certain anymore. And so somebody who is paying attention to how rhetoric works, before they become So like, thrown to the wind, or like uncertain about what's true or what's real or which end is up anymore, they notice, oh, that was fact denial. That's what that was, right? They used those two methods, right? The argument and the alternative facts. Interesting. That's interesting, right? It's an observation that happens before we, take up our position, or just find ourselves convinced by it, or allow ourselves to believe it because it coheres with what we'd like to believe or what we
Right.
previously believed.
Right. So as we begin to land this plane, Robin, how we begin to reintroduce all of this lost art of rhetoric, this lost science of rhetoric, however you want to label it, I guess, which is probably something to explore, right? I would love for you to talk about Aspasia. Is that how you say her name?
Yeah,
And her
yeah, that's
approach
correct,
to
Aspasia.
her approach. Because I love
Yeah,
it. Based on the title of this podcast, you got to know that I love her approach to to
yeah,
rhetoric.
yeah, yeah. It's brilliant. It's great. We don't we don't know too much about Aspasia. I mean, I think in the fact that we know her name is just, it's miraculous, right? The fact that in the misogynistic ancient world, and the misogynistic world that followed the misogynistic ancient world, the fact that her name and some of her thought and some quotes from her, the fact that these things have survived and come down to us is just, it's miraculous, it's precious. And so that fact alone makes her worthy of study, to anyone who's interested. But yeah, so the story is the way the story goes, and it's, attested in numerous places, including Plato. But the story was that Aspasia taught rhetoric to Socrates. Aspasia was not from Athens; she was a foreigner. She was from Miletus, and she traveled to Athens reputedly with her sister when her sister married an Athenian, and who had been on exile, and brought her with him. And uh, but what's so fascinating about this question, this method of asking questions that sort of became enshrined in the ancient rhetorical tradition, is how unlikely that backstory would make it that any of her ideas or any of her thought or anything about her period would have survived for us, because she
Yeah.
was not only a woman, she was a foreigner and she was unmarried, but she ended up in the court of Pericles, becoming a close associate and his paramour and his political advisor. And so what stands out to me, in addition to the fact that she supposedly taught rhetoric to Socrates, and perhaps even composed Pericles as some of his famous speeches, was, Socrates is remembered as having developed the Socratic method, this method of arriving at knowledge through this method of question and answer. It's sort of open ended, and a lot of times, for people who are reading Plato for the first time, or haven't really kind of seen how the whole system works, it seems like Socrates always knows where he's going. It seems like he is asking rhetorical questions, like questions where he knows the answer. But the more you read Plato, the more you realize he doesn't really know where he's going. Socrates doesn't really know where he's going. He's really kind of feeling it out as he goes. And what I like about this idea that Aspasia taught Socrates is that what did get preserved in the longer tradition was that Aspasia was known for developing this method of asking questions. And the basic idea was that it's through asking questions that we can triangulate between a really difficult and unknowable and fluctuating and inscrutable world, right? And our own perception of it, by finding out what somebody else's perception of it is. And we can get to know it better, and we can create a greater degree of certainty through that triangulation, through asking and answering about this third thing. And that's something, in addition to the other skills that I write about in the book, that's something that we've become particularly bad at, this open-ended question asking. And if you just think about some of the most enjoyable conversations you've ever had in your life, probably a lot of them involve that same thing, that same open-endedness. Not, I'm trying to defend a position or stake a claim or convince somebody that they're wrong, convince somebody that I'm right, but just seeing where it goes, right? Seeing where the idea goes without a sense of anxiety that we're losing something or that we're giving up territory or ground. And it makes sense to me that, when you think about this backstory that I gave you about Aspasia, it makes sense that she would kind of need to develop that discursive method as opposed to another one. She would need to not come right out swinging, right? She would need
Yeah.
to develop some shared ground, some shared understanding, some shared agreements, and asking is a really good way of doing that. It also can help us be less defensive, less argumentative, less easily offended, less touchy with each other. Asking questions to try to understand where somebody is coming from is a much better way for discovering, well, whether we disagree at all, right? We may think we disagree, but we may find that we don't disagree quite as much as we do. Or if we do disagree, it might reveal to us why we disagree, better than just restating and reasserting over and over again that we disagree. So that method actually became, in the rhetorical tradition, it became a elaborate and very detailed and specific way of asking questions. It became a method in exploring a disagreement in a legal setting, in a courtroom. And the basic idea was that if you couldn't figure out where the first kind of divergence of opinions emerged, you'd be much less likely to come up with a good judgment in the court case. The best thing you could do is ask a series of questions to figure out where that disagreement arises in the first place. And we have Aspasia to thank for that.
You wrote that her questions always had a certain end in sight, to find a point of convergence between opposing views. And I loved that. Again, this show's called the follow-up question for exactly that. I want to find, where is that point of divergence or convergence? And Robin, what I've found is a lot of people find it easy to ask the first question in a disagreement. But the moment they hear something that they disagree with come out of the other person's mouth, it becomes immensely difficult to ask the follow-up question, to lean into the curiosity and not want to go on the defensive and begin arguing that point of initial disagreement. So how would a rhetorician approach that? How would Aspasia have approached that?
That's a great question. One thing I like to say is that rhetoric begins at home. Yeah. The way I put it, and I don't say it in the book, but that's something I like to say in class. And what I mean by that is something I do say in the book, which is if you're really only interested in changing someone's perspective or telling them why they're wrong or reasserting what you think, then you're not thinking rhetorically. What thinking rhetorically is analyzing that moment right there. Okay, so what happened rhetorically in that moment when somebody said something you didn't agree with? A rhetorician would say, well, you're not persuaded by that, right? I would want to hear you explore why you're not persuaded by it, or why does it give you a sense of resistance? What is it about it that you find so terribly unpersuaded that you want to begin launching your own counter persuasion in reaction or in retaliation? It's that moment of noticing, like, the language has had an effect on you. Maybe the language has even created an emotional effect, right? Maybe you find yourself getting angry. Maybe you find yourself getting defensive. That didn't come from nowhere. It came from language. Why is the language affecting you in that way? Why are the words conjuring those feelings and those experiences? I don't think we can get to that point of understanding each other better, conversing better, talking better, and therefore, like, actually solving social and political issues together in a concerted way if we don't take that moment of rhetorical distance to identify why is the language affecting me in precisely this way? How might I respond to the fact that the language is affecting me in precisely that way? What the larger tradition of asking questions in rhetoric would have us do is figure out where the actual disagreement occurs. Are we disagreeing about the existence of a problem? Are we disagreeing about how we would define that problem? Are we disagreeing about how intense the problem is? Are we disagreeing about what we should do about the problem? We do generally disagree about what to do about things, right? But we're not thinking about those preliminary questions. So a rhetorical mode of asking questions would be asking us to ask those preliminary questions, to think about those more foundational differences of opinion that give rise to differences in policy. But on a deeper level, where rhetoric begins at home, it begins by noticing when the language has that strong of an effect and not giving into it immediately, right?
So to loop back to something I voiced and we kind of did a little rhetorical dive on it, is that pause in exploring our home, ourself, easier today, harder today because of what all we're exposed to and the technology we have, or is it just like lost today? How would you approach what what makes it feel, I guess, so difficult to have that pause
Mm.
in this moment today?
Yeah, I mean, I think the obvious answer is probably that it's harder because it's slower. It slows us down. It slows down our response, and we're in a world where it feels like things are speeding up. Yeah, like
Yeah,
it feels like we have to pluck our opinions more quickly. We have to respond to an issue as though we have a fully formed opinion on it when we're hearing about it for the first time.
right.
It feels like the action reaction, the rhetorical like position taking and persuasion is demanding an immediate response. And there's something in our world unnatural about that slowing down, that taking a moment, allowing ourselves to think, allowing ourselves to listen, allowing ourselves to pay attention to the language. So, in one sense, I think, yeah, the obvious answer is that it's harder. But in another sense, it's the same as it ever was because we have control over how we get information to some extent. I mean, one of the things I like to say in the book at the end is like one of my tips is it's a lot easier to do this if you read. And I don't mean scroll and I don't mean listen and I don't mean fast forward. I mean, read, like sit down and read from start to finish. Note the things you're uncertain about as you're reading. Allow yourself to remain uncertain about the things that you're uncertain about and keep reading. Something different happens when we read, when we actually take the time to pay attention to the language. It slows us down. It happens at a slower pace. So we have a certain amount of control over that speed, over that pace at which we
Yeah.
take on information. And I mean, I for one, I mean, even in a podcast like this, I usually try to get my hands on a transcript because I'm just much better with the language when I'm reading it, and I'm going at my own pace. I'm not going at someone else's pace. So, yeah, I think when we're on autopilot, it's harder, but I think that's probably always true. What rhetoric is always asking us to do is to do things on a different time scale, and that can be a challenge. But it's definitely not an impossible challenge. It's definitely doable. It just means not being on autopilot.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes total sense. Robin, what's a question that you wish you were asked more?
Oh gosh, I don't know. That's a good question. Maybe that question. Maybe that. I mean, I like it when somebody asks me a question and I don't know how to answer it, and I don't know how to answer that. I mean, I guess anytime someone's asking a question that's really about it, that's motivated by curiosity, that's motivated by a curiosity, and specifically a curiosity about what language is doing and how it's working its power. I love those questions. I don't feel like I get asked those kinds of questions very often. I get asked a lot of questions about like what my opinion is on an issue, for example, and I'm like, well, who cares what my opinion is? Like, what difference does my opinion make, right? But what I am good at and what I like to pay attention to is what the language is up to and what the language is doing. And anytime I get asked questions along those lines, motivated by curiosity, it's just deeply delightful to me. I get off on that. That's my jam.
It sounds like something that we've covered here on the show before. It sounds like there is a belief that there is a difference between a truly curious question and a question with different motivations, perhaps questions used as weapons. We've discussed
Mhm.
that before. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, yeah. And don't you feel like you can tell the difference like right off the bat? Like it's just so on the surface and so
Absolutely.
transparent. Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Very good.
Maybe the questions I like are just not rhetorical questions.
I love
They
it.
are and they aren't
Yeah.
rhetorical questions.
That's beautiful. Robin, thank you so much. Like I said, I just Man, I ate the book up. I had so many notes, so many wonderful points that we could sit here and talk for another 3 hours and not get to all of them. But I would encourage people to go get the book, The Ancient Art of Thinking for Yourself. And thank you so much. Thank you so much for the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you for reading. Yeah. And thank you for a great discussion.
Absolutely. I absolutely love this conversation. And I'll be honest, before I even read Robin's book, I was skeptical on if I would enjoy it. And partly because I didn't really understand rhetoric, like we talked about in this conversation. It's been a lost art form, a lost consideration as we think about how we communicate with each other. But I want to read you something else that Robin wrote in her book. Often we believe we're making arguments about a specific policy when in fact we're making arguments about our deeper ideologies. Our arguments often contain hidden ideologies that we're seldom, if ever, aware of. Ideologies that aren't much discussed directly, even as they determine our positions on the most fraught issues. And this is the thought to consider as we leave this episode today. The language you use, the metaphors that you throw into language, perhaps unthinkingly, the denial or the participation or the acceptance of what is fact and what is perhaps precarious, delicate, or vulnerable when it comes to what you consider to be true or not. All of these things play a role in how we communicate well with each other. And the most effective communicators consider the meaning and the intent behind their words and not just the words that they're using. And that is it's a deeper way of saying, to go back to my ask then see approach to conflict communication, it's a deeper way of saying, assume positive intent, set aside your ego and know that you can't know everything, and then go into those questions that you ask yourself. The S in the C part of the ask then see approach. Search yourself. Search what you believe. Search what ideologies and experiences and perspectives from your world are causing or are leaking into your communication. If we fail to do this, this is when we get into issues where in one situation or in one setting, what we say, how we act, what we say we believe can completely contradict ourselves in a different setting, or at least it can be inconsistent. And why that happens in many instances to be of very little concern to us, as Robin writes in her book, is the point of all of this. Digging into the words behind the words, the meaning behind the meaning. What job is our language, is your language doing? And what are you bringing forward, perhaps unconsciously, from your past that is guiding the way that you speak and the way that you go about communicating with others? It's deeply introspective work, but it is necessary if you want to be a more effective communicator. I didn't realize in a lot of ways that what I've been doing here on this show and the ideas that I've been sharing are rhetorical in nature. But this conversation with Robin helped open my eyes to a lot of that, and I appreciate it so much. So thank you for listening to this conversation between Robin and I. If you want to help this show grow, if you want to help others be more effective communicators, please share this show with others in your network and help them understand how they can rethink what they know, what they believe, what they've thought about language, and about how to be a more effective communicator. If you would ever like to get in touch with me, you can always email me at michael@rethinkingcommunication.com, or you can go to michaelashford.com, that's my website, and reach out there. I'll catch you on the next episode of Rethinking Communication. And until then, keep asking questions.